Hello, family. Enjoy this relaxing moment with Surly Tales. Remember to hit the like button, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. It means the world to us. Also, share this video with your friends and loved ones, and turn on post notifications so you don't miss future videos from us. Thank you as you do so. Sit back and relax as we dive into the story. In the heart of Accra, Ghana, there was a name that evoked both admiration and fear: Kweku Mensah. A billionaire with a Midas touch, he had built an empire from the ground up, turning failing businesses into gold. His company, Mensah Group International, owned high-rise buildings, luxury hotels, and multi-million-dollar investments that stretched across West Africa. His influence extended beyond boardrooms. Politicians, investors, and even international businessmen sought his favor. Yet, for all his wealth, Kweku was a man wrapped in steel and ice. He had no known family, no children, and no personal attachments. His employees never dared to approach him with anything other than work. In the media, he was celebrated for his brilliance but whispered about for his coldness. His past was unknown to many, but those close to him knew one painful truth: Kweku Mensah was sterile. It was a fact that gnawed at him, though he never admitted it aloud. He had discovered it years ago, after a failed engagement that ended in bitter humiliation. From that moment, he swore off relationships and any illusions of love. If he couldn't have a legacy through blood, then he would build an empire so vast that his name would never be forgotten. But the world had a way of humbling even the greatest of men. A night of power and fate. The night of the accident was supposed to be one of his greatest victories. The Mensah Group had just sealed a billion-dollar partnership with an international conglomerate, solidifying Kweku's position as one of the most powerful businessmen in Africa. He stood in his glass-walled office, high above the city, gazing at Accra's skyline. The lights from his towering buildings gleamed like a constellation of success, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself a rare smile. "Sir, your car is ready," his personal driver, Moyali, announced from the doorway. Kweku nodded, grabbing his sleek black coat. He checked his watch, 11:45 p.m. He had been working late again as always. Success, after all, demanded sacrifice. The roads were mostly empty as his Rolls-Royce Phantom glided through the city. Kweku leaned back in his seat, scrolling through business reports on his tablet. His mind was always on work, on the next deal, the next acquisition. Then, out of nowhere, it happened. The world blurred. The sound of screeching tires. A violent jolt. A crash so loud it drowned out all thought. Darkness. The price of power. When Kweku Mensah opened his eyes, he was not in his luxury penthouse. He was not in a boardroom sealing million-dollar deals. He was in an abyss, floating between consciousness and oblivion. He could hear muffled voices. Machines beeping. The scent of antiseptic filled his nostrils. His body felt heavy, immobile. Was he dead? He was alive, but something was wrong. "Doctor, he's responding to stimuli," a voice said, distant and unfamiliar. His eyelids were too heavy to lift. His limbs refused to move. Panic rose in his chest. Then, just as quickly as he had come to, the darkness swallowed him again. The world moves on. Days turn to weeks. Weeks turn to months. And then months turn to years. While Kweku lay unconscious, the world continued without him. His company, once a fortress of strength, faced internal struggles. His board of directors, once loyal, began fighting for control. His rivals circled like vultures, sensing weakness in the empire of the fallen billionaire. But there was one thing no one anticipated. His absence revealed a bitter truth. Kweku Mensah, despite all his power, had no one. No family visited him. No loved ones sat by his bedside. No partner wept over his fate. He had built an empire but left no legacy of love behind. In his cold and calculated life, he had never once imagined this possibility, that one day he would be vulnerable, alone, and forgotten. But fate was not done with him yet. Because in the quiet corners of the hospital, amid the scent of cleaning chemicals and the sound of whispered prayers, a janitor named Efua and her 2 children were about to change his life forever. And when Kweku finally woke, he would wake to a world he no longer recognized. A life of struggles. Efua Kruma was no stranger to hardship. Life had dealt her more blows than she cared to count, but she never let it break her. A single mother of two, she had learned to survive on the little she had, stretching every sadie, making sacrifices, and praying for better days. At 35, she worked as a janitor at Koralbu Teaching Hospital, one of the largest hospitals in Accra. It was not a job she had dreamed of, but it was an honest one. Every morning, she left home before sunrise, kissed her children, Kobby and Araba, on their foreheads, and boarded a crowded trotro to work. Her children were her world. Kobby, at 10 years old, was wise beyond his years, always looking out for his younger sister. Araba, 7, was full of life, her laughter a melody that made every struggle worth it. Their father had left years ago, vanishing into the wind when the weight of responsibility became too much for him. Efua had raised them alone, shielding them from the harshness of poverty with the warmth of her love. She had never heard the name Kweku Mensah before he arrived at the hospital. She didn't follow business news or care much for the world of the wealthy. To her, they were distant figures who lived in a different universe, one where people didn't worry about rent or school fees. But fate had a way of bringing the most unexpected lives together. An unseen bond begins. It was a quiet evening when Efua first entered room 307, the VIP section of the hospital, reserved for the wealthiest patients. She had been assigned to clean there that week, a task that came with strict instructions. No unnecessary noise, her supervisor had warned. No lingering. Clean quickly and leave. The patient is important. When she first saw him, she felt an unexpected wave of sadness. The man lying in the hospital bed was a stranger, but something about him struck her. His face was handsome but devoid of life. His body, once strong, now lay still, trapped in a world of silence. Machines beeped around him, keeping him alive. He was alone. No visitors. No family. As the weeks passed, Efua noticed something. The nurses barely spoke to him, treating him like another routine. No one ever came to check on him, except doctors doing their rounds. The loneliness in that room felt heavy, pressing against the walls. One day, as she mopped the floor, she did something unusual. She spoke. "I don't know if you can hear me," she said, her voice soft, "but I just wanted to say, I hope you wake up." It was silly, she thought, talking to a man who couldn't respond. But it became a habit. Each time she cleaned, she spoke to him, telling him about her day, her children, even her frustrations. "You know," she said one evening, shaking her head, "Kobby's teacher said I need to buy new textbooks. Do they think money falls from trees?" She chuckled. "I bet someone like you never had to worry about school fees." Of course, there was no answer. But she continued. And she wasn't the only one. One evening, when she brought her children to work because she had no one to watch them, Kobby and Araba peeked into the room. "Who is that, Ma?" Araba asked wide-eyed. "A patient," Efua whispered. "Come on, don't disturb him." But the children were fascinated. "Why does he sleep all the time?" Kobby asked. "He's not well." That night, Araba did something that melted Efua's heart. The little girl walked up to the bed and placed a small teddy bear beside the man. "For him," she whispered. And just like that, Kweku Mensah, the billionaire who had everything but love, became a part of their lives. Sacrifices and silent prayers. Months passed. Efua continued her routine, cleaning his room, speaking to him, and watching over him in ways no one else did. When her shift ended, she stayed a little longer sometimes, adjusting his blanket, making sure he was comfortable. Then came the bad news. One afternoon, she overheard the doctors speaking in hushed voices. "The hospital can't keep covering his expenses indefinitely," one of them said. "No family has come forward. His accounts were frozen after his accident. There's only so much we can do." Efua's heart clenched. Were they going to stop his care? Abandon him just because no one was paying? That night, she sat by his bed, staring at the man who had become an unexpected presence in her life. "Maybe I'm foolish," she murmured, "but I don't think you deserve to be left like this." And so, she made a decision that defied all logic. She used her savings, the little she had set aside for emergencies, and began covering small costs. She couldn't afford the big medical bills, But she paid for small things, better sheets, toiletries, even a radio so that the room wouldn't be so lifeless. Her sacrifices did not go unnoticed. The nurses whispered about the janitor who cared for the billionaire. Some laughed, calling her foolish. Others admired her heart. But Efua didn't care. She had once been abandoned. She knew what it felt like. She would not let it happen to him. A family he never knew he had. As time passed, Kobby and Araba became even more attached. "Good night, Mr. Sleeping Man," Araba would whisper each evening. "I think he's listening," Kobby once said seriously. "Maybe he just can't talk yet?" Efua smiled at their innocence. But deep down she wondered, could he hear them? Could he feel their presence? One evening, after a long, exhausting day, she sat by his bed and sighed. "You know," she said softly, "if you ever wake up, you owe me big time." She laughed to herself. She had no idea how true those words would become. Because Kweku Mensah was going to wake up. And when he did, he would find that his world had changed forever. A billionaire without a name. As months turned into years, Efua found herself woven into the life of a man who had no idea she existed. The world outside moved on, yet within the four walls of room 307, time stood still. Kweku Mensah remained unresponsive, his body breathing but his spirit trapped in some unknown place. She had never asked why no one visited him, but deep down she knew the answer. This was a man who had built a kingdom but had no one to share it with. In all her time cleaning hospital rooms, she had seen countless patients, and even the poorest ones had family who came to sit with them, hold their hands, and pray. But not Kweku. Not once. The only people who visited were doctors and nurses doing their routine checks. There was something profoundly heartbreaking about it. Even though he lay in a luxurious private hospital room, with the best medical care that money could buy, he was just as abandoned as the homeless patients in the overcrowded public wards. And yet, Efua refused to let him remain forgotten. She was just a janitor, just a single mother trying to survive, but something about this man pulled at her soul. So she stayed. And without meaning to, she became his family. A choice that could change everything. One morning, while mopping the corridors, Efua heard hushed voices outside the administrative office. She wasn't one for gossip, but the mention of Kweku Mensah's name made her pause. "The hospital can't keep footing the bill indefinitely," a doctor was saying. "But what do? We can't just stop his care," another voice argued. Efua felt her chest tighten. She peeked inside and saw two senior doctors discussing Kweku's case. One of them held a thick file, flipping through pages of unpaid bills. "The board is considering moving him to a public facility," one of them finally said. "We need the private room for patients who can actually pay." A chill ran down Efua's spine. They were going to move him. She didn't know why it hurt so much. After all, what could she do? She was just a janitor. And yet, that night, as she sat in room 307, watching Kweku's still face, she made a decision that could change her life forever. "I don't know why I'm doing this," she whispered, "but I'm going to fight for you." She didn't have wealth. She didn't have power. But she had something stronger than both. She had heart. And that was enough. The price of compassion. Efua knew she couldn't stop them from transferring Kweku, but she could buy him time. She gathered every bit of savings she had, money she had been putting away for Kobby and Araba's school fees, and used it to cover part of his expenses. She knew it wasn't enough, but it was something. When she handed the money over to the hospital accountant, the woman stared at her in shock. "You do know who this is, don't you?" the woman asked. Efua nodded. "He's Kweku Mensah. A billionaire. If he wakes up, he won't even remember you." Efua swallowed. "I know. Then why are you doing this?" Efua had no answer. Because it made no sense. It made no sense to use her children's school fees to pay for a man who had no idea she existed. It made no sense to sacrifice her own survival for someone who would never thank her. And yet, she did it anyway. Because sometimes, the heart does what the mind cannot explain. An empire in ruins. What Efua didn't know was that outside the hospital walls, Kweku's empire was crumbling. The Mensah group had been a fortress when he was in charge, but without his ruthless leadership, cracks had begun to form. The boardroom had turned into a battlefield, with executives scrambling for control. Deals that had once been solid were now slipping through their fingers. And in the shadows, a man named Daniel Owusu, the one person Kweku had always suspected of betrayal, was waiting to strike. Daniel had once been Kweku's closest business partner. But unlike Kweku, who had built the company with his blood and sweat, Daniel had always wanted power without work. He had waited, patiently, like a snake in the grass, knowing that the moment Kweku fell, he would rise. Now, with Kweku locked in an endless coma, Daniel saw his chance. He had already started manipulating board members, convincing them to sell off key assets. He knew that if Kweku ever woke up, the company he had built would no longer be his. And Daniel intended to make sure he never woke up at all. The weight of secrets. As weeks passed, Efua began to notice something strange. The hospital staff, who had once ignored Kweku, now seemed interested in his case. She overheard whispers about business rivalries and unpaid debts. One evening, a man in a sleek black suit arrived, asking questions about Kweku's condition. He wasn't family. He wasn't a friend. And something about him felt wrong. Efua knew she had no right to interfere. And yet, she felt an unease deep in her bones. Was it possible that someone wanted Kweku to stay asleep forever? The first sign of life. One night, as Efua sat in the dimly lit hospital room, she reached for Kweku's hand. She had done it so many times before, sometimes to check if he was warm, other times simply to remind herself that he was still alive. But tonight was different, because the moment she touched his hand, his fingers twitched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was something. Her breath caught in her throat. For the first time in years, Kweku Mensah had moved. And though she didn't know it yet, everything was about to change. The moment the world changed, Efua sat frozen, staring at Kweku's hand as if she had imagined it. Did he just move? For years, she had cleaned this room, spoken to him, cared for him, and watched over him with no sign of life. But now his fingers had twitched, his breath seemed heavier, and there was a subtle shift in his expression. She leaned in closer, her heart pounding. "Kweku," she whispered. Silence. She told herself she was imagining things. The exhaustion was probably playing tricks on her. But as she was about to pull away, his eyelids fluttered. And then, ever so slowly, his eyes opened. A rush of air left her lungs. It was the first time she had ever seen his eyes, deep brown, almost black, filled with confusion and something else she couldn't name. He blinked, his gaze shifting around the unfamiliar room. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no sound came out. Efua sprang to her feet, nearly knocking over the chair. "Doctor," she called out, running to the hallway. "Doctor, he's awake." Her voice echoed through the hospital corridors, stirring chaos as nurses and doctors rushed toward room 307. And just like that, after 3 long years, Kweku Mensah had returned to the land of the living. A mind stuck in the past. The hospital erupted into a frenzy. Doctors flooded into the room, checking his vitals, adjusting his foredrip, shining lights into his eyes. Nurses moved swiftly, recording every movement, every sound. Kweku's voice was hoarse, barely a whisper, but one word left his lips. "Where?" He swallowed painfully, trying again. "Where am I?" Dr. Ba, the physician who had been overseeing his care, stepped forward with a reassuring smile. "You're in Koralbu Teaching Hospital, Mr. Mensah. You've been in a coma." Kweku's eyebrows furrowed. "For how long?" The doctor hesitated before answering. 3 years. The color drained from Kweku's face. 3 years? His mind raced, trying to grasp the impossible. He had gone to work. He had signed a major deal. He had gotten into his car, and then what? His memory was fragmented, blurry. He lifted his hand weakly, staring at his fingers as if he didn't recognize them. His body felt foreign, thinner, weaker. He tried to move his legs, but they barely responded. What happened? His voice was stronger now, the panic creeping in. "You were in an accident," Dr. Ba explained gently. "A serious one. You've been in a coma ever since." Kweku closed his eyes, his mind spiraling. His company. His business. His empire. What had happened to everything he had built? His eyes snapped open, urgency replacing confusion. My company. Mr. Mensah, please, the doctor interrupted. You need to rest. Your body has been inactive for years. It will take time to recover. But Kweku wasn't listening. His entire life had just been erased in an instant. And he needed answers. The stranger in his life. The next few days were a blur of medical tests, therapy sessions, and endless questions. But amid the doctors and nurses, one person stood out. Efua. She was always there, lingering in the background, her watchful eyes following him. She never spoke to him directly, never interfered with the doctors. But whenever he woke up, she was there. And he didn't understand why. Who are you? He finally asked one evening when the doctors had left him alone. His voice was still raspy, but stronger now. Efua hesitated. She hadn't expected him to ask, not yet. She swallowed, unsure how to explain. I work here. At the hospital. Kweku studied her, his sharp business instincts kicking in despite his weakness. You're not a nurse, he said. No. You're not a doctor. No. Then why are you here? She exhaled, gripping the fabric of her dress. How could she possibly explain? I was assigned to clean this room, she said finally. I've been taking care of things while you were asleep. Kweku frowned. Taking care of things? His eyes scanned the room, landing on small details he hadn't noticed before. The fresh flowers by the window, the warm blanket draped over his legs, the neatly arranged bedside table. These weren't things hospitals did. His gaze flickered back to her. Something wasn't adding up. A billionaire at rock bottom. The reality of his situation hit him hard in the days that followed. He was no longer the powerful man he once was. His body was weak, his muscles atrophied from years of disuse. Walking required assistance, and even simple tasks like eating exhausted him. And worst of all, his empire was in ruins. The news came from Dr. Ba, who hesitated before breaking it to him. Your company, there have been changes. Kweku's jaw tightened. What kind of changes? Your board of directors assumed control in your absence. Some divisions were sold off. There was a power shift. His mind sharpened, despite the fog of his weakened body. Who took over? The doctor hesitated. Daniel Owusu. The name hit Kweku like a thunderbolt. Daniel. The one man he never fully trusted. The snake who had waited in the shadows. Kweku clenched his fists, the foreline in his arm trembling. 3 years. 3 years of silence, and in that time, everything had been stolen from him. He had to fix this. He had to fight. But first, he had to stand. The woman who wouldn't leave. As Kweku plotted his return, Efua continued to watch from the sidelines. She knew the moment he was strong enough, he would leave the hospital. And when he did, she would fade from his life. That was how it was supposed to be. Yet, late at night, she found herself sitting by his bedside as she had done for years. You must hate this, she murmured, watching his sleeping form. Being weak. Depending on people. He didn't answer, of course. But she knew the truth. Kweku Mensah was a man who had never relied on anyone. And now, he had no choice. As she rose to leave, a voice stopped her. Thank you. She turned, eyes widening. He was awake. Watching her. His gaze was unreadable, but the words had been real. He had never thanked her before. She wasn't sure why, but it made her chest tighten. Because even though she knew she should walk away, a part of her wasn't ready to say goodbye. A war waiting beyond the hospital walls. Kweku didn't know why this woman had helped him. He didn't know why her children spoke to him as though he was family. But he knew one thing for certain. The world outside had forgotten him. And he was going to remind them exactly who Kweku Mensah was. Because this was not the end. This was just the beginning. A man on a mission. Kweku Mensah had always been a man who controlled everything in his life. His business, his wealth, his relationships. He had built an empire through sheer willpower and ruthless determination. And now, after 3 years of silence, he had awakened to find it all slipping through his fingers. The thought of Daniel Owusu sitting in his chair, signing his contracts, and wearing the crown he had forged with his blood, made Kweku's skin burn with anger. But first, he needed to recover. Day after day, he pushed himself through painful physical therapy, forcing his weak muscles to move, his stiff legs to carry him. The doctors were astonished by his progress. Most coma patients took years to regain full mobility, if they ever did. But Kweku was different. He had something greater than medical science driving him: revenge. He would reclaim his throne. He would make those who betrayed him pay. And yet, even as he fought to regain his strength, another battle was unfolding, one he didn't even realize he was fighting. The battle for his heart. A woman who stood by him. Efua had always known that once Kweku regained his strength, he would leave. Men like him didn't belong in places like this. He was power and wealth personified, and she was just a janitor, a woman who had no place in his world. And yet, she found herself unable to pull away. She told herself it was because of her children. Kobby and Araba had become attached to him in a way she never expected. Every evening when she finished her shift, they would sneak into his room, talking to him as if he were part of their family. Araba would place her small hands in his, whispering secrets only a child could understand. Kobby would sit beside him, telling him about school, football, and the unfairness of his mathematics teacher. And Kweku listened. At first, he had been confused by their attachment to him. Then, he had been irritated. And now? Now, he found himself waiting for their visits. Waiting for their laughter. Waiting for Efua. But he didn't understand why. The past that refused to stay buried. One evening, as Kweku sat on the hospital balcony, gazing at the city lights, Efua approached him. "You shouldn't be out in the cold," she said softly. He turned, studying her. "Are you my nurse now?" She smiled slightly. "Oh, just someone who has seen you at your worst." Something in her voice made him pause. "I still don't understand why you did it," he admitted. "Why you stayed." Efua hesitated, then sighed. "I've seen what it means to be abandoned," she said finally. "And I couldn't let that happen to you." For a long moment, they just stared at each other. And for the first time in his life, Kweku felt something unfamiliar. Gratitude. Genuine, bone-deep gratitude. But before he could respond, a knock interrupted them. Dr. Ba stepped onto the balcony, holding a file in his hands. "Mr. Mensah," he said cautiously, "there's something you need to know. The secret that changed everything." Efua stood to leave, but Dr. Ba stopped her. "You should stay," he said. Kweku frowned. "What is it?" The doctor hesitated before handing him the file. "These are your medical records," he said. "There's something unusual." Kweku flipped through the pages, scanning the documents. Then he saw it. The paternity test. His heart stopped. He looked at the results, his hands tightening around the paper. His eyes darted to the name of the child in question. Kobby Kruma. He felt the world tilt. The percentage was undeniable. 99.9% match. Kobby was his son. His breath caught in his throat, his mind unable to process the information. He looked up at Efua, his voice barely a whisper. "What is this?" Efua's face was unreadable. A long, heavy silence passed between them. Then finally she spoke. "A deal that cost her everything." "I never meant for you to find out this way," Efua said quietly. Kweku's chest tightened. "So it's true." She nodded. He felt like the ground had been ripped from beneath him. "How?" he demanded. "When?" Efua exhaled shakily, gripping the balcony railing. 3 years ago," she began, "before your accident, I was desperate. My children were starving, and I had no way to pay our rent. I was on the verge of losing everything." Kweku's mind raced. 3 years ago, that was when his lawyers had arranged for a surrogacy deal. He had wanted an heir, a child of his own. But the surrogacy had fallen through. The agency claimed complications had prevented conception. Or so he had been told. "Efua," his voice was dangerously low, "are you telling me that you—" She nodded. "I was the surrogate?" A sharp breath left his lungs. His eyes darted back to the paternity test. Kobby, his son. For 3 years, his child had been right in front of him, and he hadn't known. Efua swallowed hard. "The agency lied to you," she admitted. "The pregnancy was never terminated. I carried him to term." Kweku's hands clenched into fists. "Why didn't you tell me?" Tears brimmed in her eyes, but she held them back. "Because you weren't supposed to know," she said. "I wasn't supposed to know. The deal was simple. I carry the child and he would be given to you. But when your accident happened, the agency disappeared. They left me with nothing." Her voice broke slightly. "I had no choice but to raise him myself." Kweku was silent. He had spent his entire life believing he would never have a child. Now, not only did he have one, he had missed 3 years of his son's life. And the woman standing before him had been the one to protect him when the rest of the world abandoned him. The weight of truth. Kweku turned away, his mind a storm of emotions. He should be furious. He should be demanding explanations, demanding answers. But instead all he felt was regret. Regret for the years he had lost. Regret for the pain Efua had endured alone. Regret for the fact that, despite everything, he didn't hate her. In fact, he felt something else entirely. Something terrifying. Something he had sworn he would never feel again. And for the first time in his life, Kweku Mensah, the ruthless billionaire, the man who had built an empire on control, realized he was no longer in control at all. Because Efua and Kobby had already changed his life forever. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. The weight of a father's love. Kweku Mensah had built his life around control. He had controlled businesses, controlled markets, and even controlled people. But as he sat alone in his hospital room, staring at the paternity test that confirmed Kobby was his son, he realized that control had slipped through his fingers. He had a child. A child he never knew existed. A child who had spent 3 years calling another man uncle while his real father lay in a hospital bed, unaware. The weight of it crashed over him like a tidal wave. For the first time in his life, Kweku wasn't thinking about power or wealth. He wasn't thinking about reclaiming his company or seeking revenge against those who had betrayed him. He was thinking about a little boy with bright eyes and a gap-toothed smile who had sat beside him, talking about school and football, never knowing the man in the hospital bed was his father. And he was thinking about Efua, the woman who had made an impossible choice and sacrificed everything to protect a child that was never meant to be hers. He had built an empire, but she had built a family. And for the first time, Kweku Mensah wasn't sure which was more important. A mother's fear. Efua sat in her tiny one-bedroom apartment, her heart racing. The truth was out. For years, she had feared this moment. The day Kweku would discover Kobby was his son. She had never wanted to deceive him, but what choice had she had? The surrogacy had gone wrong, the agency had abandoned her, and Kweku had been in a coma. She had done what she thought was best. She had raised Kobby as her own, pouring every ounce of love into him, never once imagining that the day would come when she would have to explain why the man in the hospital bed was his real father. And now that day had arrived. What if Kweku wanted to take him away? What if, after all her sacrifices, she lost the one thing that mattered most? A knock at the door made her jump. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Kweku stood in the dimly lit corridor, his face unreadable. He looked different, stronger, more determined. More like the man she had heard about before the accident. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he held up the paternity test. "We need to talk," he said. A battle of the heart. They sat across from each other in the cramped living room, neither of them speaking at first. The only sound was the distant chatter of Kobby and Araba playing in the next room. Finally, Kweku broke the silence. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "I don't know how to be a father." Efua swallowed hard. "Neither did I." He looked at her, something shifting in his expression. For all his wealth, all his power, he had never raised a child. But Efua, she had done it alone, with nothing. And she had done it well. Kobby was kind, smart, and full of life. Not because of Kweku's money. Because of Efua's love. Kweku exhaled. "I'm not here to take him away from you." The relief that washed over her was overwhelming. "But I want to be in his life," he continued. "I don't know what that looks like yet, but I want to try." Efua studied him, searching for any sign of dishonesty. But there was none. The ruthless businessman was gone. In his place was a man trying to make sense of a life he never expected to have. And for the first time, she realized something terrifying. She had spent years fearing that Kweku would take Kobby away. But now, she was afraid she didn't want him to leave. A son's truth. The hardest part was telling Kobby. Efua and Kweku sat him down the next morning, their voices careful, their words slow. At first, the boy just stared at them, his mind trying to process the impossible. "You're my dad?" he asked, looking at Kweku. "Yes." Kobby frowned. "But, you've been in the hospital?" "I was in an accident," Kweku explained. "I didn't know you existed." Silence. Then, slowly, Kobby's face broke into a small, mischievous grin. "So, does this mean I get 2 birthdays now?" Efua laughed, the tension breaking. And just like that, the hardest conversation of Kweku's life turned into something simple. Something natural. Something that felt like family. Reclaiming the throne. There was still unfinished business. Kweku had been gone for 3 years, and in that time, Daniel Owusu had stolen his empire. But he was back now. And he was ready to fight. He walked into Mensah Group International for the first time in 3 years, his presence sending shockwaves through the building. Employees whispered, board members froze, and Daniel Owusu, seated comfortably in the CEO's chair, went pale. "Kweku," Daniel said, forcing a smile. "This is unexpected." Kweku smiled coldly. "I imagine it is." He dropped a thick file onto the desk, documents proving Daniel's embezzlement, backdoor deals, and fraudulent transactions. "You stole my company," Kweku said calmly. "You gutted it. And now, I'm taking it back." Daniel stammered, scrambling for an excuse, but it was too late. Security entered. Lawyers followed. Within the hour, Daniel Owusu was escorted out in disgrace. And just like that, Kweku Mensah was back on top. But something was different. For the first time, he wasn't doing it for power. He was doing it for the family he never thought he'd have. The future worth fighting for. Weeks later, Kweku stood in Efua's small apartment, watching as she packed a lunch for Kobby. He had spent years chasing wealth, but now, watching her move around the tiny kitchen, he realized something. This was what he had been missing all along. This was home. Efua turned, catching him staring. "What?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. He hesitated, then took a deep breath. "I have a proposal." She crossed her arms. "If this is a business deal, I swear." "It's not." She blinked in surprise. "I want to be here," he said. "With you. With Kobby and Araba. I don't know how to be a husband. I don't know how to be a father. But I want to try." Efua's breath hitched. This was not the man she had met 3 years ago. This was someone new. Someone she had helped rebuild. Tears filled her eyes. "You really mean that?" she whispered. Kweku nodded. She smiled. "Then let's try." And as he pulled her into his arms, Kweku Mensah, the billionaire who once had nothing, finally had everything. Because in the end, wealth was not measured in money. It was measured in love. The end. If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.